What's up, everyone? It's been like 3 weeks. Welcome to Law and Order with me, where I'm the Noerrder portion, don't know anything about the law, and my attorney, Ben Ryan Malali. We're going to go over legal stories. Sorry, we're a little late. We're celebrating 420 today, ladies and gentlemen, 420. As you all know, it is National Lima Bean Respect Day, so we were discussing our favorite lima bean dishes. So we got a little too into it, and we were a little late coming on, but Ryan, a pleasure as always. Once more, we're not bereft of stories to talk about. We had to select and wean down the amount of legal stories that are out there, actually.
It's an endless barrage of stories, always, Rob. But I have to apologize to you and the audience. Last week was my doing. My audience knows this, but occasionally the attorney work becomes disproportionate, and it's not possible for me to keep my dates online. So I apologize to you and the audience. But we're back. And boy, do we have some stuff to talk about, Rob. And we got it from the Supreme Court, from the courts of appeals, from the courts of public opinion, to the courts of California, all kinds of news.
Absolutely great. And it's weird, like sometimes it's serendipity. It almost feels like the show could take a different flavor just depending on what the news story that just breaks like a few days before. The story we're going to start with, it's a story that I put importance on because I think my favorite justice there now, Thomas, and I don't know, I think yours, but
he's moving up the rankings.
It's definitely a story that illustrates one of the things I think is important in sort of looking at things through a legal framework about where our politics should be. And I thought it was really important, was going to cover. And then I saw you like commenting, it was like, literally, this is one of the most important speeches probably in the past few years, like as far as the political scene or the legal scene in the United States. So, of course, we're talking about Justice Thomas, and he gave about an hour presentation sort of talking about progressivism, conservatism, the values that the country was founded on and what we should be striving to achieve and where we should go from here. You want to set this speech up a little, like before we get into the details of what he was saying?
Yeah. Absolutely, Rob. I thought this was one of the most important political speeches of my life. And the reason is that Justice Thomas was laying out the foundational American morality. What is it that we as Americans believe? And this shouldn't be up for grabs. It's written down in the Declaration of Independence. We believe that all men are created equal, meaning equal moral worth, not equal abilities, equal moral worth, and that they were endowed by their creator with certain natural rights, amongst them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the purpose of governments is to secure these rights. It's what our founders said. It's what we as a country, it's our founding belief. It is self-evidently true, as the founders said. And what he was contrasting it to is the progressivism that came into our country in the 1920s, with Woodrow Wilson and John Dewey and people like this. And what they wanted to do is progress beyond these values. No longer was it about liberty. It was about the government giving you things. It wasn't about you being an individual standing tall on your belief and your faith and, beholden to your creator. It was the government gives you rights. You're as equal as the government makes you. And it was a deeply moving speech, a deeply philosophic speech. But if you're somebody who follows this channel, if you follow somebody like Rob or you follow Andrew Wilson maybe, and you are invested in the idea of American philosophy and how that's inextricably interwoven with our faith and our faith in each other, this is an incredible speech.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it's so funny how many people today speak for what the founders intended. And oftentimes what they're saying, I don't consider myself like a great student of history, but even a cursory look, you see a lot of people are putting words into the founders or the idea of what the creation of this country was about that don't match history whatsoever. For example, one of the big phrases that you would be totally excused for believing is how important democracy, particularly direct democracy, was to our founding fathers. It's not there. The word's not in the Constitution. And we are to believe that, they've perverted this idea of all men are created equal, like you said, to be like, Well, through the government giving these rights. And so equity, or, we need to correct past harms and everything in order for the government to make people equal on like a scale of ability or a scale of worth. And that's not really what's going on. And I think that Thomas does an excellent job of sort of outlining that. Who was he giving this speech to? Do you know the organization?
He was at the University of Texas, so he was speaking there, and he gave about an hour remarks, and then he did a Q&A afterwards. And Rob, you're entirely right. Like the Declaration, and he said this in his remarks as well, but it states clearly the purpose of the government is to secure our God-given natural rights, right? And this is an important point that Thomas made. Your natural rights, and because I know people like Andrew oftentimes try to distinguish between moral rights and legal rights. Your natural rights are not legal rights, and God forbid they're not the human rights people are talking about.
Right.
Your natural rights are the dignities and moral features of you as a human. If you were starving on a desert island alone, you would still have them. And that's how you know that they don't come from the government. They come from our human nature and our relationship with our Creator. And Justice Thomas told this insane story. It really made me think. He grew up in the South in segregation. Segregation was still a thing when he was growing up, right? So his government was telling him that he was lesser. He was worthless. He was not the same as white people and didn't have the same moral worth as white people. That's what his government was literally telling him. But, and he said, his family weren't literate people. They weren't educated, but they believed in the values of the Declaration gospel. They taught them gospel. So he knew that his moral worth was not less because the government lacked the power to make it so. And this is the key distinction. If your rights come from the government, you only have as much moral worth as the government gives you. But if your rights come from another source, from our Creator, then you have your moral worth always, no matter how many evil men try to suppress it or oppress you. And this totally destroys the oppressor-oppressor narrative because, yes, there are evil men and, yes, bad things happen to him, but it didn't shake his faith in his religion or his country because he knew who he was and where he stood. And this is a deeply powerful message. And it is totally contrary to what he exposed, which is the progressive status quo. Because the progressives, they're very clever with language games. They corrupted the values in the Declaration. So liberty became freedom the government gives you.
Correct.
Security becomes the government feeding you, right? And then they reframed the entire conversation, and classic liberalism became modern liberalism. And now people are saying, this modern liberalism sucks. Why is this so bad? Because it's not really liberalism.
That's right.
It's the progressive status quo.
That's exactly right. And here's a little snippet now. You could easily find this whole speech. It's on X. I think it's on Fox's YouTube channel. But here's a little snippet just so you can hear from Thomas himself, just 30 seconds. But it is like almost an hour speech.
Progressivism seeks to replace the basic premises of the Declaration of Independence, and hence our form of government. It holds that our rights and our dignities come not from God, but from government. It requires of the people a subservience and weakness incompatible with a constitution premised on the transcendent origin of our rights.
I mean, it's beautifully said.
Beautiful.
It's exactly what you're saying there. And it creates a weakness, right? Where, one of the things about having transcendental rights or rights from God is that there is no stronger basis that you could imagine than that. Rights being based on the government. Governments can be corrupt. Governments can be fallible. Governments can be disinterested, right? Governments can change. And so if your rights are based on those things, all of the rights are sort of built on a foundation of sand. And for example, if the government tomorrow says, you know what, you're right to if you say I have a right to privacy because the government tells me, and the government tomorrow says, no, you don't because we're worried about terrorism. Do you still have that right? Of course not. Not in the eyes of the government. And so if you rely on the government for those rights, quite literally, the government could say, you don't have it now. If you believe that your right exists beyond that government, then that's a right you could claim. Now, the government could use force to take that away from you, but you still say that the rights I have are superseded of the government right. And I think that's one of the things that we lose sight of. It's different, but I'll say when the crash course I got in postmodernism and debate in college, we talked about one postmodernist, Michel Foucault. He had this concept called biopower. And in a nutshell, this is the easiest way I could explain it. He's like, if you give the government the power to turn the lights on, you also give them the power to turn the lights off, right? In other words, if you rely on the government for your subsistence, that's all well and good. But if the government tomorrow says, you know what, we're no longer going to do that, you've given away your power. Now imagine that in the concept of rights. Once you rely on the government for, well, that's what's going to give me my right, you also give the government the power to take that away, right? Because you are now reliant on them and your moral justification goes away. If you're like, well, I have this right because the government. Okay, what if the government says no? You don't get to go, well, wait, I still have the right. You wouldn't.
And you couldn't, because you have no standard against which to measure the justice of the government. I just wanted to show this. If you guys want to see the whole speech, I did a live react to it a little bit ago. Just posted it yesterday. So if you want to see the speech, America's Rotting, Terrifying Ideology, go watch the video. You can find it there. And of course, if you're going to watch somebody's channel, you might as well watch mine.
Yes, of course.
But and we can take that. I mean, actually, go watch my video, but we can take it down. We don't need to be plugging the whole time. But grifting aside, the thing that Justice Thomas laid out, because I think Justice Thomas has a remarkable knowledge of U.S. history and U.S. philosophy. Like, I mean, you think about it, he's been a Supreme Court justice for 34 years. He's an originalist, so he spent a lifetime honing this knowledge. So he had the perfect historic example to give to prove your point perfectly, Rob. Not abstractly, just down the middle. The champion of modern progressivism, the man who said we should progress beyond the values in the Declaration of Independence, that this idea that your rights come from God is archaic and agrarian, and we need to have a better system. We need to be more like Europe. That's what he said. It's all nonsense. That man was President Woodrow Wilson. Now, here's another fun fact about President Woodrow Wilson. When he was the governor of New Jersey, he signed a law that created boards of experts that would sterilize citizens if they were too imbecilic to reproduce. Because if we got to have good genes in the gene pool. Yep. You don't have a natural right to pursue happiness. If you're an idiot, we should sterilize you. That way you don't have idiot kids that are going to screw it up for everybody. And his abhorrence for natural rights, for the Declaration of Independence, for true American values, was contrasted with his love of this other set of values, that the state should guide the people and should control the people. And where did he get that idea from? What was he modeling himself after? 1920s Germany. That's what he was modeling himself after. Now, Rob, I don't know if you're a history buff, but it turns out that 1920s Germany was about to make a series of very bad decisions on the basis of the same ideology that Woodrow Wilson was championing. The idea that rights don't come from God, so we can do whatever the hell we want. That we're the government, we tell you what your rights are. And that was Nazi Germany, that was Stalin, that was Mao, that was the worst atrocities of the 20th century.
Woodrow Wilson, he may be our worst president. In fact, I think he is, right? He also brought us, in case for those of you watching that want to get pissed off, the income tax. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson. The Federal Reserve. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson. So, very bad. And was definitely like the elitist of his time. When you juxtapose him to people like Teddy Roosevelt and other folks like that around that time, like he was the exact opposite of that ledger as far as like elitist. The people that know more should make the decisions. You should have to rely on the government for your rights and for your protections and all of this stuff. And we're still bearing the fruits of that 100 years later.
Well, the income tax is a perfect example, Rob, because like if you have a Declaration of Independence-based view of America, then the federal government should be infringing on our liberty as little as possible. There's going to
Correct.
be some. Having a military, you might need to have people fight up to get rid of the invaders. Like, there's going to be some infringement. I'm not so utopian that I think there'll be none, but it should be minimized. The income tax is not a minimal infringement. That's think about going from a world with no income tax to going to a world with income tax. The government has a totally different role in your life. They're allowed to reach into your pocket whenever they want. That's a different view of the government, and it's a different view of the country. And what Justice Thomas pointed out is that for a long time, this progressive vision, which has rebranded itself modern liberalism, and this classic Declaration of Independence vision have uneasily coexisted. But it's reaching a boiling point. The oil and the water aren't mixing anymore.
Right.
And a lot of our culture war, a lot of the fight that people are talking about. Like when people ask me, Ryan, how can you possibly support Trump? You criticize him all the time. You criticize him on free speech. You criticize him on tariffs. You criticize him on this. You think he shouldn't have done the Jesus picture. He shouldn't have said this. He shouldn't have said treason, the seditious six. You were critical when he brought charges against Comey. You have all these criticisms about Trump, and I do. How could you possibly prefer him to Harris? Justice Thomas gave the answer. It's because there's a lot of stuff I don't like about Trump, but he is the only president I've ever seen who's been effective in rolling back progressivism. And that is the actual fight. That's the actual fight. It's the values of the Declaration versus the values of progressivism. And he's winning that fight. So it's hard for me to look the other way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that in a weird way, look, don't take this as me trying to defend Trump too much. I criticize him all the time, particularly lately. But in a weird way, the battle was being lost so much against progressivism that it was almost inevitable if someone was going to push back. It was going to be a boorish character, right? Mm-hmm. Like Trump, it was going to be tough for someone with a suit and a tie speaking politely. Like Thomas would be someone that would good that you can imagine. Mm-hmm. But to have the charisma and sort of to have the interest of the general populace in order to win a general election, it was going to take an interesting character, right? And, a lot of what you see, I think, even from conservatives, like if you look at the traditional conservatives, like maybe a John Thune or something like that, that you see in the Senate, it's very much norms. And we very much have to go to the halls of Congress or go into these sacred halls and have these robust debates. The progressives aren't interested in that. Right? Listen to James Carville this week. That came out and was like, we're going to add Puerto Rico as a state. We're going to add D.C. as a state. We're going to add 4 justices to the court. Right? We're going to end the filibuster. We're going to do all of this stuff. And we're not even going to run on it. In fact, don't run on it. Run on being a moderate and then do it. And they will. And they've been doing that. And, one of the things I talk about a lot is the lawfare that I see. Even if you hate Trump, and that's perfectly fine, you should be against the weaponization of our FBI, of our intel agencies, of district attorneys all across the country that are specifically going after their political opposition. And I feel that it started with the people that are in positions of power in the establishment and going after people that are outsiders, people like Trump. So for me, I feel the same way, where it's look, it's easy for me to say this is better than the alternative because the alternative is basically further entrenching a system. And with this progressive stuff, the further you go down the hole, the harder it is to dig out of. This reminds me of the debate, and I watched the majority of this, that you had with Connor, right? Where Connor was like, I'm not a progressive. And you're like, but you're not defining progressive as it should be. By progressive, what you were basically saying is there's a fundamental question. Should people have their right to their own self-determination, or should the government be intervening to do what they think is best for them? And Connor's basically you're getting Connor to admit people are too stupid to know what to do with their money. So the government should have to take the money and set it in funds. And people are too stupid to know what books to read. So the government should be here are the books. And he's basically yeah, that's the difference. And it's easy to see, there's problems with that, even if it's a benevolent and competent government. But what happens when there's a tendency to be well, wait a minute, we're going to be a little corrupt, or we're going to have some incompetence. Now, all of a sudden, you've relied on these institutions for your rights, and they don't know what they're doing, or they don't have your best interest at heart. And you can see how quickly we run afoul of the idea of things hey, we should all have the right to self-determination. No, the government disagrees now. This is the group that's important. And they're going to, and then the other thing is, as you know, and Thomas, it alludes to this, once you go down this road, every problem that arises, the answer is always, well, more government. The government causes some problems, so they don't say, whoa, let's pull back. The income tax, wasn't that supposed to be temporary? And now it's like, you can't imagine it. To suggest getting rid of it, I heard, who was it the other day? It was like AOC or something was talking about the nightmare vision of Republicans. They want to get rid of the income tax. Perish the thought. Like, that's some great evil. It's like, yeah. You know?
Well, but also, you got to you got to give like the devil credit where he's due, right? Like the progressives, as it makes sense because they're kind of postmodern to their core, are very good at word games. So what they did, and you could see this in the way that Connor was talking about, because he's like, I'm not a progressive. I'm like, of course you're a progressive for all the reasons you just said, Rob. But what they did, the reason he doesn't think they're a progressive is that the progressives did this. They changed the country. They changed the country. They changed the country. Then now you're here. And then they say, all this that we just did, that's the status quo. If you want to change that, you're a reactionary. You're crazy, right? And the progressives are the communists over here. But then it keeps on going, right? And this is why, like, I know that like Destiny and Wick and co, they've been having this big thing about like, we should exile Hassan. And I'm like, you guys don't understand. You guys are 20 years from being Hassan.
Yep.
He's just ahead of the curve. Like there's no principal difference between you and him. What you have, because you emptied the philosophy, the American philosophy, this idea that our rights come from our creator. Once you believe that, you have a principled reason to reject Hassan. But then you have a principled reason to reject all of modern liberalism, right? But what they want to do is they want to say, no, Hassan's authoritarian and we value, we're anti-authoritarian. Well, it's like, well, why? Why are you anti-authoritarian? Because you have the right to self-determination and liberty. But you gave that up. You traded it for a hill of beans. People came to you and said, I'll give you some bread tomorrow if you give up your rights today. And you said yes. And then cleverly, they rebranded that as liberalism. But it's not. There's nothing about it's unrelated to American liberalism. It's a totally progressive notion.
For those people, see, Hassan, I would put someone like Vosh. I'm not claiming to be an expert on either Hassan or Vosh. Like, I'm not horsing around here. We're not going to saddle up and make a bunch of horse puns about Vosh here or anything. But the difference with them is like they're more open and with their beliefs. Like I remember Vosh, infamously, in my opinion, said, with Kyle Rittenhouse, his rights were to lay there and hope the mob didn't beat him to death. That was it. That was his option. He was not allowed to defend himself. So you can see at least he's honest with the insanity, though. He said he wants to see a world where people were taking shots out windows at groups like Patriot Prayer. That's Vosh. Destiny and them, they have principles. But the problem is, all of those principles are secondary to their highest principle, which is Orange Man Bad. And so, for example, they could be like, we are absolutely free speech, and screw Trump when he said this about flag burning. Something I agree with, by the way. I think Trump goes too far in the flag burning stuff. But then when you're like, yeah, but you guys are like all about that the Twitter files were bullshit and who cares and blah, blah, blah. Because it's every one of their principles could be sacrificed to get the Orange Man. But the problem is, this has been the case with progressives for a long time. It's always, there's this one boogeyman. It's just, it was Bush. I mean, you're around the same age as me. People, if you're younger, you don't realize this. The left talks about George Bush now like he's this quirky old man. Oh, he's painting pictures and shit. And sometimes you'll see him at a Texas Rangers baseball game. Man, it was better when Bush was there. They wanted Bush tried in The Hague with Cheney. Like they wanted this dude executed. And now they're like, wow, they said Mitt Romney had binders full of women and we're going to put black people in chains. Mitt freaking Romney, milquetoast Mitt Romney, and so it's always, what they do is they're always like, what we believe is the status quo and that's okay. And these people over here further to the left are more radical. But if you look on a timeline, you can see how the Overton window shifts with even the moderate progressive. And so we're in this perverse position where basically Donald Trump is a 2006 Democrat. That's basically what he is. If you listen to a Trump speech on immigration and then go back to a 2006 Obama speech, They're almost identical. Or Hillary back in the day, she was like, we can't leave these illegals stay here. We can't have anchor babies. And now to even suggest it, if you're like, whoa, I don't know about this like birth tourism shit, they're like, you genocidal maniac, you fascist. And it's like, just 20 years ago, this was a mainstream Democrat talking point. Bernie Sanders in 2014, you could find audio of him being like, open borders is a Koch brothers conspiracy. It's all about big business and right-wing donors, you know, and now it's like, if you say that, you're a racist. And so it's like, when I listen to these people on the left go, yeah, but that Hassan's a maniac. Hassan's just ahead of the curve. That's where you all will be if you continue to win. The only chance that these people don't become that is if the other side wins enough to force them to say, look, we have to check in our most radical impulses, because if not, we're going to lose general elections and we're going to lose power. But as long as they keep winning, they're going to keep, it's a runaway train. They can't stop it. They're adherent to the most radical voices by the nature of what progressivism is. There's too much incentive to use that government power.
And again, their philosophy lacks grounding, right? They'll say something like, I'm a liberal, so I like free speech. But why do you like free speech? It's not enough just to like it. That's a preference. Okay, you like it, but maybe tomorrow you won't like it as much because it's inconvenient. Why do you like it? Because of man's inherent dignity, man's freedom of conscience, man's right to self-determination. That's why we have freedom of speech. That's why we have freedom of religion. That's why we have the Second Amendment, because our natural rights come from our creator. And if you understand that the philosophy is grounded in that belief, then when someone says, I'd like you to sell your philosophy for a short-term benefit, you say, hell no. That's offensive to me. That's offensive to my beliefs. That's offensive to my relationship with God. This is not like, it's not up for sale. It's not up for sale. And I have this, Justice Thomas gave this quote, and I'm fond of it as well. So if you'll indulge
Do you want me to bring it up?
Oh, no, I'll just read it.
Okay.
But this is Calvin Coolidge, who was the last president who truly openly fought progressivism. He named it, he fought it, he understood it, he said the philosophy out loud. And he said this on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Justice Thomas's speech was to celebrate the 250th anniversary. So 100 years earlier, this is what Calvin Coolidge said. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth and soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. And the reactionaries, Rob, have been winning. And that's the task in front of us, is to reinvigorate the American people around this American philosophy. And Justice Thomas, he laid out a siren song. This is the thing that we have to do. We have to do it right now. We have to do it today. We have to do it in our communities with each other. We have to talk about these values. And we have to do that because if we reignite these American values, the progressives will lose, because progressivism is obviously contrary to these values.
Correct.
And if we let them die, the progressives will win. And honestly, I expect to see nothing but dirty tricks. Like he's corrupt, he's a bad, like you're going to hear nothing but media smears about him for a week because of this, because it was a call to action. The speech was a call to action.
Remember, get your super chats in. We will read them either during the show or after the show, we promise. Jefferson C. Post over on Ryan's channel gives $2, says, doesn't Hassan's progressivism mix with Islam too? Of course. And this goes to what you're saying. They don't have grounding. That's how you could have these inherent contradictions. Like, how could you consider yourself like pro LGBT rights, but you're also like pro Palestine or pro, the most absurd Islamic regimes? It doesn't matter, because for them, it's all about power. Once your grounding's not there, postmodernists talk about this a lot, right? I'm not deep philosophical, but it's the idea of this. If you have grounding, you have truth, right? You could say, my beliefs are based in this ground thing that's stable, a capital T truth. Postmodernist doesn't believe in that. They don't believe that there's capital T truth. They believe there's subjective truth. There's my truth and there's your truth, but there's not a universal truth. So the idea that we're all created equal is absurd, right? Because there is no universal truth. And so all that matters is power. And so my discussion with you right now, it's not us seeking to get to some truth and having some agreement on what the country should be about. It's me and you engaged in a power struggle. We might seem to agree, but in reality, it's a power struggle. And if there's no truth, then there's no lie, right? Now, this is a quite literal interpretation of what some of postmodernists suggest. But if you extrapolate that to a conversation of rights, well, it's how you're able to say, one of my favorite clips in the world, I played it last week. It's of Vosh, who I liken to Hassan in many ways. And he's watching a clip of these women. And they're on some program talking about horrible assaults that they've gone through. And Vosh pauses to stand on his soapbox and he says, oh, pretty much every woman I know has gone through this. And then this woman speaks up and she goes, well, I was in a country and I was assaulted. And because the person who assaulted me was Muslim, the local police didn't want to take it serious. And he's like, wait, what? This lying bitch, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, how could you do that? And it's not a conscious action on his part. Right? It's not a conscious action that he's like, oh, I'm going to cut. It's inherently, the tribalism is so strong, the my side versus your side so strong, and there's no fundamental grounding in that it just comes out that way. And so that's what you're talking about. When you talk about these people that don't have this grounding, it's how they're able to make all of these absurd, like, one of the stories we're going to talk about later is like Eastman getting disbarred or the Twitter, certain things that they say you should be allowed to say online versus things that you aren't. Me and you'll struggle. We'll argue about people we've supported and say, we don't like what they're doing here. But them, they're just like, we don't care. If you're attacking someone we don't like, then it's all good. And so that's what happens when you adapt this progressive mindset and you don't have a grounding in sort of your fundamental and foundational beliefs, that all of a sudden everything's justified as long as it means you and your side's winning.
Yeah, and one of the things that Justice Thomas said, Rob, is that this idea is repugnant to American. He didn't say repugnant, that's me, but he said his intention. But I'm being more forthright.
Sure.
It is contrary to American values, and these values, he took us back to the Revolutionary War, right? When our founders wrote, we found these truths to be self-evidently true, that we have these natural rights from our creator. Well, why do they have to say that? Because under English rule, there was no equal moral worth. The king had divine right. So you had no right to rebel against him. You had no moral worth compared to the king. This was the most revolutionary, radical idea in history. And it created the most free and prosperous country that has ever existed. And that's what the progressives are trying to erode. That's what they're trying to take away from us. And I'm a big scholar of the Declaration of Independence. I read it to my chat all the time. I argue about it all the time. I debate it all the time. Justice Thomas called our attention to a line that I've never talked about, but it was very important, and I didn't really think about this. These men, if they lost the war, they were committing treason. England was going to kill them, right? So that's how seriously they took these beliefs. And he, at the last line of the Declaration, says the following: and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And what his call to action is, can you do less than that? Can you do less than that? Because if you start talking about these values, the progressives in the room are going to try to shame you. They're going to make you feel uncomfortable about saying that you believe your rights come from God, that your rights are inalienable and don't come from the government, and that government rights, that's sand, that's preferences enacted into law. But our rights are not from the government, and we have inherent human dignity, and that you're willing to fight for that. This is a revolutionary idea, and people will ostracize you. The progressives will make you feel silly. They'll say, can you prove that? Can you ground that? They'll attack you. They'll make you want to feel small so that you give up this ground. But you must know that if this idea lives, they are destined to lose. That's it. If you teach your kids this idea, they are destined to lose. If you build communities around this idea, they are destined to lose. So this is Justice Thomas really, on some level, begging the American people to wake up, to wake up and get out there and start actually organizing and talking to people and rekindling the flames of our uniquely American philosophy. Because they've abandoned it in Europe, Rob. They've abandoned it in Europe. It's up to us, like it always was.
How much of it do you think is like, I understand there's Europe, there's our Congress and our executive branch here, but do you think some of his speech has to do with maybe some frustration of what he's saying with like Ketanji Brown Jackson and some of her dissents?
He was really, really careful because he has great decorum in this way. Someone tried to ask him in the Q&A afterwards, like, oh, what do you think about the court? And he was kind of like, the most he'd say is he's like, oh, that court with Scalia, that was one of my favorite courts. I really enjoyed that. And then like not say anything about the modern court. So he
is good like that. And that's a good tradition, by the way.
Yeah, he's very careful. But I do think what he is saying is that there is a contrary tradition that's happening right now. And we saw this with a lot of legal decisions we've gone over. Maybe in the Boasberg decision, we saw some of this. But we saw this in California, where that judge was, the law says there shall be no judicial review. And she interpreted it to mean, I have power of judicial review. And you're like, well, how could you possibly come to that conclusion? It's like, well, those words don't have meanings, and I can reach any conclusion I want. And this is I don't think there's room for these ideas to coexist long term. Eventually, we're going to have to decide, are we living in the founders' America or Woodrow Wilson's America? And, personally, I'm not that big a fan of eugenics. So,
right.
I don't.
Really?
I don't
Yeah. Real quick, Jefferson again, thanks so much. Another two says, we saw what Islamists do to commies in Iran. The contradictions are endless, right? Between these groups that there's an affinity for the progressives and how they don't get along with each other. So kind of piggybacking off this, one of the things I saw some of the Live and Learn guys saying this, quoting Thomas's speech, and I think it was Josiah I saw saying this was just like, this is outrageous. This is unbecoming of the court. How could he say something like this? So just to nip this in the bud, there is nothing about the decorum of the court. In fact, it's quite common for justices to give speeches on campuses, outlining their judicial philosophy, sort of talking about the philosophy of the framers, etc. This is not that uncommon, correct? And you didn't see this as anything of like him calling out liberals on the court or anything of that nature.
Well, first of all, I didn't take it that way at all. I think he was commenting. If you read the transcript, he didn't comment on one current event. Correct. In the speech. Not one current event, not one case. He was talking about philosophy and American history and his personal experiences with both exclusively. That's what he was talking about. Now, but I think the question that, if liberals are getting really offended by this, the question should be why? Justice Thomas said, I'm concerned that people are abandoning the values of the Declaration of Independence in the name of progressivism. And they go, that's outrageous for you to attack me that way. It's like, well, are you not abandoning those values? One easy thing you could say is, I'm not abandoning those values. But they're not saying that. They're not saying that, Rob, because they can't. Because they don't want those values. Because those values imply a limited government. If you believe that people are strong and independent and made in the image of God and entitled to self-determination, you give them liberty. You don't give them a nanny state. And that's this is the thing. Ultimately, they were called out directly without him ever saying their name because they can't deny that he's right about the fundamental philosophy.
They know it's them he's talking about because he's correctly outlined what they believe. If it wasn't, they'd say, well, it's not us. Sure, there might those. The other thing that's hilarious about that is we've seen liberal justices say far worse. For example, Ginsburg directly came out criticizing Trump in his first term, if you remember. Mm-hmm. She was forced to later apologize. And in fact, do we not have just this week, Sotomayor, right, has issued an apology for comments she's made about some of the conservatives on the bench. Is that not true?
Yeah. She made some remarks about Justice Kavanaugh. And it wasn't just that she made them; she wrote them in an opinion. And she's actually, I might be misremembering, but she had some sharp words about him, and she apologized. right? So it's not like, and that's, by the way, much more direct
Correct.
than anything
Yes.
Thomas said. Like, it was a direct comment about Kavanaugh. So it's not that justices never comment publicly. And also there's this kind of like, I don't know, some of this is almost like pearl clutching in a way that's kind of, it's hard to take seriously. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like if a liberal comes in and they say, oh my God, it's beyond the pale that Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson would comment that they favor left-leaning things, and Justice Thomas and Alito commented that they favor right-leaning things. I mean, who possibly could have known that this was the alignment of the court? Like like it's kind of a joke. Like we do understand that these justices are not blank slates. They have beliefs. They're people. I don't expect the left-leaning branch of the court to side with the right-leaning branch of the court on every issue. I expect them to be judges and apply the law and apply their judicial philosophy as best they can. And by and large, they do. But if we get to the point where one of the most learned men on the subject in America is inappropriate for sharing his wisdom on the subject in which he is one of the great living experts, what are we talking about?
Right. It's crazy. And one thing, like, this is hard to say because from my perspective as sort of a populist conservative or a Christian conservative, one of the things is I feel that we should get angrier. And it's a discussion we've had a lot. And I think that we have been pushed around. We've been asked to sort of be the bigger people for a long time, to the point where we find ourselves being pushed further and further and further. And we need to draw a line in the sand. And sometimes that means not just being super polite. Obviously, there's a time and a place. However, juxtaposed to that, there's something I find very cool about the historic behavior of the court, of the Supreme Court, where it's sort of a club that they are like, you don't get to talk shit on us, right? Like, where it's sort of like they have each other's back. Even if you go back to those courts, there's some very, polarizing figures on the court, like when it came to their political ideology. You may even look at like a Ruth Bader Ginsburg versus like a Thomas or a Scalia. And my understanding is, reading a lot of like what RBG said about Thomas, they were like good friends. Mm-hmm. She was like, no, we may have varying degree, but there was a respect amongst them that it was like, we may vehemently disagree, but we do not think that we're doing so for like, because we're grifters or, we respect the fact that we are learned people that have, significant disagreements. I think that, unfortunately, there is a trend that might end, or that might start to chip away. And I look to a lot of this leaks and stuff that's going on there. And this story that came out is, I think, pretty troubling, which is now we have a second leak. Of course, the Dobbs decision leaked. Now, the decision was leaked, and I have to admit to being a little confused by this one. I haven't read a lot. And it has something to do with what they're calling a shadow docket. Have you heard? This was leaked to the New York Times. And once more, this is like to cast aspersion on sort of the more right-wing, because this is something that would be disparaging to the right. So do you know what they're talking about with the shadow docket and sort of the nature of what this leak was?
Yeah. So the shadow docket refers to, like, normally when the court decides a case, they write a long opinion, and you can read the opinion, and the logic of the opinion is, it speaks for itself. And that's how you know what the law is, not just because of the outcome, but the logic of it, right? And it's important to give that, because that's how people understand what the law is. However, there are times when something comes before the court that's not the final resolution of a case, right? Like, for example, there's a TRO, a temporary restraining order, and that comes up to the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court, they decide whether to keep the temporary restraining order or not, but they're not deciding the whole case. They're not deciding the outcome of the case at that point. They're just doing this procedural thing. Now, at that time, when they decide, they can choose to either give you some reasoning or not. They can just write an order that says, nope, the TRO is bad, get rid of it. Or, yep, the TRO is good, keep it. That's the shadow docket. It's when they're issuing orders on lesser matters without giving fully reasoned opinions. And, one of the criticisms that has been levied is that the Supreme Court's using the shadow docket, so-called shadow docket, more. It does help them dispose of cases, and dispose of cases more quickly and efficiently. As you can imagine, trying to get 5 people to sign on their vote to like a 40-page piece of legal writing takes some time and energy. You got to have argument. It's a whole thing. So it's kind of a method for them to control the clog on the docket and to make things more efficient. But this leak was essentially saying that this was political maneuvering, that this was the court, putting its hand on the scale and tilting it in favor of right-leaning politics. And I guess what troubles me about this, Rob, is when the court, for most of my life, had a left-leaning slant, where were the leaks? Right? Like, it seems like it's easy to have decorum when the progressives are getting what they want. But when they're not, all of a sudden, there's, now we're having leaks from the court, which is, for those of you who aren't in the profession, that's not a small deal. Like, it's hard to imagine a young lawyer who has the honor of clerking for the U.S. Supreme Court choosing to leak things to the press and jeopardize their relationship with their judge, as a kind of like act of, I don't know, attention seeking, or I don't know, they're trying to save the country or whatever their justification be. It's hard to imagine that. And it makes it seem more likely that maybe this was authorized by a justice, because it's hard to imagine a clerk taking that step on their own, but it's possible. We don't know.
Well, here's where it becomes troubling. So, like, Jackson gave a speech almost simultaneously with Thomas's speech, if I remember, complaining about the shadow docket. Then within a day or two, the New York Times gets this exclusive about the shadow docket. And once more, we have a major leak designed to put political pressure and pressure on the conservative members of the court. It seems to only go in that direction. It doesn't seem like there are major leaks that are coming out for decisions that the left is on the top of before an election or something like that would be deemed to apply pressure to them. And it also, the other thing you have to look at is, why is there never any consequences for these leakers? It's as if, like, it's an impossible task for us to find where these leaks could have came from. And the Dobbs leak is one of the worst judicial stories I've ever heard because of what it led to. Everybody knows that the potential overturn of Roe v. Wade was going to be a huge deal and probably lead to violence and riots. That was known, right? And so when the Dobbs decision comes, of course, this is followed immediately by the leak of actual justices having their homes protested, having their children's schools' addresses being broadcast, which eventually led to an assassination attempt, right? Where someone was arrested for attempting to assassinate Kavanaugh, I believe.
That's correct.
Now, Molly Hemingway wrote this, and she'd been on this for a long time. This is about the leak of the Dobbs decision. She says, Alito asked the dissenters to make the completion of their dissents their priority because delay of the decision was a security threat. Abortion supporters had an incentive to kill one or more of the justices in the majority to change the outcome. The dissenters demurred. Gorsuch broke up, asking for a date by which they might be done. The dissenters refused to give a date. Everyone knew that the leak posed a serious security threat for the justices. Since decisions do not take effect until issued officially from the bench, the death of a justice before could alter the results. The threat of assassination increased dramatically. And so it's the decorum of the court for not only for that intentional delay to occur while the dissenters could turn on their television and see the violent protesters outside the homes of the conservatives, right? But then for the leaker to never be brought to justice. It's just ho-hum. And of course, I could predict that this will happen again. Let me make another bold prediction for you, Ryan. If the leaker this time isn't held accountable, the next time there's a politically advantageous thing for leaking to harm the right, they'll do it again because there's no downside. There are no consequences. And increasingly what I'm seeing it's one thing to see politics. It's one thing to see commentators like me or you that are becoming more partisan, or professors that are becoming more partisan, or Congress people becoming more partisan. But there's something about the legal system that you would like to think, yes, we understand that it's humans there, but it's supposed to be above that to the best of their ability. And instead, what I'm seeing is lower court justices acting like this is life or death, Trump's evil, so even though it's not within my scope, I will intervene. And we're seeing clerks leaking stuff and like all of this crazy shit. And it's troubling because to me, it signifies like maybe this last bastion of like some sort of sanity in that court we were talking about. We could have spirited disagreements, but we all acknowledge that is that going to be something of the past. In the next 20 years, will we look back and say, this is the norm? Just leaks to harm the other side, dissenters dragging their feet in purpose, with the hopes that the people in the top get harmed. It's very troubling, I think,
Well, I think that what you see consistently is that whenever the progressives lose ground, all of a sudden, all bets are off. All bets are off whenever they lose ground, right? Like these kind of like legal professional ethics. These are not small things. Like as someone who lives in this world, you might notice I don't tell stories about clients because I have legal obligations not to. I didn't clerk at the Supreme Court level, but I clerked at the district court level. It's not as exalted, but like feather in my cap.
It's prestigious,
It's actually a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And I don't tell stories about my judge because that's in confidence. I was there to serve his interests as he was interpreting the law, right? I'm not there to live my agenda out. Like that's not the goal of it. And I do think that there's a thing that's happening, and I do think it's a progressive trend where everything has to mutate to serve the ends of social justice, right? This is what we saw at the universities. They ceased to be truth-telling institutions and truth-discovering institutions, and they got turned into social justice institutions, and they changed. They changed so much that, people have less confidence in Harvard now than they ever did.
Yep.
Yeah, I think Yale's had a study about the crisis in Yale because people have lost confidence in them, and they've lost confidence because they changed. They're not the same institutions they used to be. There is something about this that is inherently a little bit of a conservative idea, where you would say, my fidelity to my role as your lawyer, as a clerk, as a judge, is more important than my political beliefs. My fidelity to my role within this system to promote the values I believe in, it's more important. And if you don't believe in any kind of grounded philosophy, you don't have any kind of consistent moral framework, I don't see why you do that, right? It's like, well, the only thing that matters is progress towards my preferences. So, ultimately that's what you do. And all these norms give way over time. But I think we have to push back on that. We have to, because, how can you have the rule of law if you don't have these norms? How can you have the rule of law if judges don't behave like judges and lawyers don't behave like lawyers? It is a very big threat to our way of life. And I think we have to, call this out. And as Justice Thomas called on us to do, be open about it and don't be afraid of talking about it. Because I think that for a long time, people have been a little bit on the sidelines, a little gun shy, saying I know something's wrong, but I don't know how to articulate it. And I'm afraid that if I say something, people are going to make fun of me, or they're going to say I'm a cretin, and I'm going to come across badly. But now I think there's people who are articulating these ideas. I think you're one of them. I'd like to think I'm one of them. And you can find us, you can follow us, and we can tell you what the arguments are. And then you can, this is what we can actually mobilize around this.
It's very tough because if you could, I have my own little part of when I debated, there was a judge. The unique thing about me and you, if we do an online debate, right? There's seldom you won or you lost. Sometimes, you beat Pisco, we know that. The judges showed it. But you understand my point. Most of the time, there's not a judge. In debate in college, you could complain and say, I think the judge was wrong. But guess what goes in the record book? The judge's decision. That's it. 50 years after I'm dead, if someone goes back and looks at my record of debate, they'll know if I won round 3 of the Wake Forest tournament in 2004 because there's a W or an L. That's it. You could complain, but that's all there is to it. And one of the things that made me a decent debater was that I understood that a judge is human, right? And sometimes you might make arguments that would objectively, or rather for the vast majority of people, lose you the debate. But you know what that judge likes to hear. So you play to that. And I'm sure it's like that in the legal world. If you're arguing, a criminal defense attorney, and what this particular judge lets you get away with or not, you're more likely to tailor your argument because it's a human. The law it's like science. Law itself is this static thing, right? Justice is blind. But the people that are involved with the law are humans. They're fallible. They're biased, right? And so when you know that, all you have to do is look at our political landscape. and see how people lather, like, I understand that there is some of the both sides to it, but for me, it's overwhelmingly on the left, where people shroud themselves in this sort of moral high horse, where it's like, well, we're the good people. And so therefore, we are protecting this country from this Third Reich, for the Fourth Reich.
Mhm.
That's what Donald Trump is. And we have to do it. We have to. And so if I'm on a jury, well, I know what I have to do. And if I'm, go down the list, right? And
Mhm.
you would like to think, yeah, but attorneys aren't going to be like that. You know, the bar review board isn't going to be like that. Judges aren't going to be like that. I'm not so sure. And that gets to the next story. Eastman, who was an attorney, John, I believe his first name's John.
Yeah.
John
Yeah.
Eastman, who was an attorney for Trump, who wrote the famous Eastman memo. Now,
Mhm.
this is a memo I know you're not a big fan of. I wasn't as well. I think you have more problems with it than me. But as far as I saw, this was a proposed legal strategy that was issued, that what people call the alternate electors, right? And so Eastman wrote 2 memos, actually,
Mhm.
and he has officially been disbarred in the state of California. People on the left, or that favor this, say good, the alternate electors was heinous, he should not be allowed to practice law. People on the right, and people like myself, say this is once more selective outrage and selective enforcement. We can see people like Kevin Kleinsmith, who made up evidence in order to go after Trump's team to try to get wiretaps and FISA warrants, right? And that dude only lost his license for a year, and Eastman's going to be disbarred forever. What say you? Is it common, or do you agree, either one you want to answer, for disbarring someone for a memo that didn't even become a legal strategy?
Well, this is kind of sui generis, right? There's really no comparison point to it, because lawyers take what we call aggressive positions all the time, right? Now, an aggressive position is lawyer speak for, yeah, I'm not really sure the law is exactly where we think it is, but you know what? I could make an argument. I can make an argument. And here's the thing about that. Um, as a lawyer, the standard is what's called frivolousness. Like, yeah, anyone can make an argument for anything. But if you sign your name on something, if you're a lawyer, if you're an officer of the court, you have to limit yourself to arguments that aren't frivolous, right? Because otherwise we're all wasting time and people are just making bullshit arguments all the time. Eastman's argument was pretty bad. I'm not going to, I can't sugarcoat this. Like, the idea, again, just go back to common sense. If the vice president is allowed to determine how the election is counted, that seems like a system has a lot of mischief built into it, right? Like, it doesn't seem like that's going to be a rule that you can follow. Now, disbarring him is quite a lot. It's quite a lot. I didn't realize he was barred in California, which is that might have been his first mistake. But I'm torn on it, because I think permanent disbarment is a very heavy consequence to put on an attorney. But I can't sugarcoat it. I do think his arguments were frivolous. Like, I don't think that he had a legal leg to stand on with those arguments. And I think that it put, quite candidly, it's a dangerous thing to do, because Trump's not a lawyer. Like, if you tell him this is legal, he might believe you, right? So I don't know. I'm of two minds. I would have maybe preferred to see a lighter consequence, but I did think he had something coming.
Well, now I'll say this. I'll push back on you somewhat. Now, I also didn't like the alternate electors, but your explanation, it's like, well, clearly that would be problematic. Yeah, but that's sort of counter of what you've said on other cases. Like, for example, clearly it's problematic to assume birthright citizenship with like birth or tourism.
Mhm.
But your argument is, yes, but it's irrelevant if you're an originalist. You're not looking at the predictable shitty outcomes that could happen. You're looking at what did they mean when they wrote it. And it is entirely possible when they're writing this that they're not envisioning in a world where this would ever be something that would be important. So like, yeah, just ceremonially, we have the VP do this. So I'm not so sure. And my thing is this, we need to be, I didn't like the alternate electors, not from a legal standpoint. That wasn't my forte. It might be legally dubious. In fact, I would say it most likely is. But my issue with it was, how would I feel if the other side did this? How would I feel if, John Kerry gets up in 2016, or I'm sorry, Biden gets up in 16. It's like, you know what? No, Trump didn't win. Russia interfered. Nope. I'd have been fucking outraged, so I get the whole idea. I didn't like the strategy. However, I think just like there are certain things that you just have to take as a necessary evil. Here's an example, the pardoning power.
Mhm.
I fucking hate some of these pardons Trump's done, and I think quite honestly they're corrupt. However, I think that the intent of the pardoning power and the importance of it is so sort of sacrosanct that we have to take the bad with the good, and that we can't start to limit and say, well, wait a minute. I feel the same way here. If we accept disbarring people for memos like this because we're like, well, this was clearly a legal theory that was so outlandish and so frivolous. If we start doing that on the political scale, the incentive is going to be so high to just keep that moving. And so what happens is you'll have a chilling effect. For example, we can see that people like Sidney Powell, a bunch of other people that worked as attorneys for Trump or Trump-connected people, they've all been investigated. Attorney-client privilege has been pierced. This seems to be another level in what we see as always one-sided attacks. And the goal is to say this. If you go against the establishment, and particularly the Democratic organization, and you're a lawyer, we're going to fucking come for you. We're coming for you. And so don't even get hired on. Leave these people with inferior legal representation. And I think because of that, this is very troubling what they've done to Eastman. And we're going to see that it's just going to continue to snowball over and over and over. And meanwhile, if you could point and say, but here's similar shit that occurred on the other side. Here's left-wing attorneys that won't matter. Perish the thought. They won't give a fuck. Those people will be given a slap on the wrist every time. You know it, and I know it. And so that's why I think this is such a big deal. If in a vacuum we could trust that these people would do it judiciously and it wouldn't involve political partisanship, fine. I could accept this one case possibly. But we know that's not what's going on. If Eastman had worked in 2024 for the Kamala campaign and wrote the exact same memo, he'd be hailed as a fucking hero and wouldn't have missed a day of work.
So the thing about this, and I take your point, Rob, by the way, and I'm not going to disagree with you about like the political vindictiveness. I have no disagreement with you on that point. But to the first thing you said about the original meaning, the 12th Amendment, which is the amendment that's at issue, this was not part of the original Bill of Rights. This happened because in the original presidential elections, the system was whoever got the most votes was president, whoever got the second most was vice president. So you had this problem where the guy who was your political enemy would be vice president all the time, right? And they were like, holy shit, this isn't working. So the idea that they weren't thinking about what would happen if the vice president was counting the votes is like, I think they were thinking about that, actually. They amended the Constitution because they saw problems with the vice president having these roles when he didn't actually have a political alignment with the president. And then they were trying to come up with a system that would fix that by putting the vice president into political alignment with the president. But of course, if the vice president's in political alignment with the president, that's where this problem comes from. So, I mean, and we don't need to get into the weeds on it. Legally, I don't think Eastman's theory was particularly credible, and I think did border, if not land directly in the frivolous category. But would he have gotten full disbarment or a suspension? That's, I think, the kind of question that I think you're raising, and that's an interesting one because I don't have good comparisons for this, Rob. To be totally honest with you,
I'll go for it. He would not have been suspended; would have been lauded and applauded if he wrote this same memo for Kamala Harris and worked for her instead. I've no doubt. Look at some of the shady shit Norm Eisman's been accused of. He's in no jeopardy. There isn't no bar that's going to revoke him. They don't give a shit. Orange man bad. And it's, by the way, it's similar to a story we talked about when we were talking about the JAG courts and the people going through there. And we were reading all this. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, we were covering this, just how left-wing that's became. I think these bars, I think it's the same way. And so it's like, if you do something so egregious beyond the pale like Kevin Kleinsmith, where you're literally changing evidence to get a FISA warrant against a presidential campaign, they'll be like, I guess we have to suspend you for a year. And that's as egregious as it gets, right? Other than that, if you're just general, well, we're mixing it up and we're doing egregious things. Well, we withheld exculpatory evidence. Well, we did this and that. It'll just be, but in background, they're like, good, fuck Trump. Some super chats real quick, because I know at least one's referencing this. Jefferson, again, thank you. $2 says common law requires passing the tradition forward.
Yeah, that's what our legal system is based on.
Totally
you
agree.
have to.
Yep. And then another $2 says clerks leaking, clerks who become judges.
Well,
I mean,
we're going to talk about Boasberg in a second. So
yeah. So, I mean, that's certainly, if you're like, well, it's these clerks today, it's not the justices, well, they're the judges of tomorrow. And then what will their clerks be doing if this is sort of accepted? Patrick Alb, $5, thank you, says, for that reason, to protect the justices, the majority opinion should come out immediately, and the dissent, who cares, should come out whenever. I mean, it's an interesting thought. I don't know. I mean, I think that the best system is just keep it under wraps until they're ready to do it. But I mean, if this started to become a problem and for whatever reason the court can't keep their house in order, then I could see. And I remember reading, this has happened in the past, that the majority's just been like, we can't wait any longer for the dissent, so we're just going to release the majority opinion with the caveat that, like, the dissent is still working on the dissent. So it's happened, but I would not like to see that become the norm. I think there are problems with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not courteous, right? Like, if they're dissenting and they're on the Supreme Court, they deserve to be able to give their reasons for why they disagree. And as a matter of courtesy, that makes total sense. Now, of course, in a world where there's leaks happening, courtesy might not be the number one consideration.
Correct. J.W. Thorpe, $10, thanks, says, I really feel the leak came from one of the justices, hence why no one's facing consequence. It's possible.
It's possible. I wouldn't, no one knows. And if someone tells you they know, they're selling something. But if I had to bet on it, I think I would agree with you, because if it was a rogue clerk, maybe they'd keep it under wraps and you wouldn't hear about the consequences. And maybe that's how they'd keep the house in order. But you figure if it was a rogue clerk, somebody would know something about somebody getting in trouble, because that's just not a thing a clerk is empowered to do.
Naughty Germ, $5. Thank you so much, my friend. Phil Coggins, what a name. $5 says, it's a nihilistic worldview that supposes the only thing in life that matters is power, and it'll lead to dark ends. Of course. And it's very difficult on my side of the ledger, right? Because it would be appealing for me to just be like, let me give you an example. I say this all the time, and studies back this up, by the way, right? Like, if I despise a lot of, like, our left-wing politicians, like, I'm no fan, for example, of Joe Biden. But if I was on a jury and Joe Biden or Hunter Biden or someone was the person that I was, going to listen to the crimes and make a judgment, I would try my best to hear the crime and make a real judgment. And I think that there's more of a propensity on the left to just be like, we don't give a shit about all that. We care more about the players. Oh, this is a guy who's on our side, not guilty. I think one of the saddest things I've ever seen, and this was aired on, I think, CBS. I play the clip all the time. It was a black woman who was a juror in the O.J. Simpson trial.
I saw that.
And they asked her, they're like, you claim that this was revenge for Rodney King, that you guys knew he was guilty. Did you know that? And she's like, yep. It was like, basically 8 of us. And imagine thinking that a murdered an innocent man and woman. And you're like, I don't care. As a black guy did it, so good for us. Like, that would never cross my mind. Like, I happen to be Christian, I happen to be conservative, I happen to be right wing, and I think that that's one of the things we see, because the left views, and this is backed up over and over and over in study after study after study. The left feels so morally virtuous and superior that they're able to be like, well, that matters more than the details, right? The law matters less than who is involved. So if it's a murderer, but he's on our side, well, we'll be lenient because he's on our side. But if it's someone who probably didn't murder someone, but they're on the other side, well, we're going to be harsh because they're our opponents. And so I agree that I talk to people all the, like, I'll give you the most common argument, Ryan. When I was arguing against critical race theory, I would say, I don't want our schools indoctrinating people for shit. I want them teaching math and reading and civics, right? And I talk to people all the time, like Christians that are like, no, we want them indoctrinating them into Christian views. Because if every time they're in power, they say, we'll indoctrinate them into progressive values. And then every time we're in charge, we say, nope, don't indoctrinate to any values. And then they get back in charge and say, now indoctrinate to progressive. Guess who wins in the end? They do. And that's game theory. That's true. So it's, for me, I have to remember myself that it's nihilistic to say, if I adapt that same worldview, you know what? Screw it. The gloves are off. It's just about power. We will do unto you the same corrupt, shady shit that you do unto us. There's a temptation, but we should still try to avoid it. We should still try to operate within our moral and legal framework and try to not make shit up, but actually pursue justice aggressively. I think we should do it aggressively, but not go outside those bounds.
Well, and this is something, again, going back to Justice Thomas's speech that he talked about, where he said that people would visit America from Europe, and they'd remark that they never found, compared to Europeans, Americans were philosophically illiterate, but they held to the American philosophy much more closely than any European held to their philosophy. And that's actually, there's something powerful in that, right? Where these ideas are not supposed to be airy and academic and, the subject of endless philosophical debate. These are supposed to be like blood and bones. It's just how it is. It's just how it is that if I'm a juror, I'm going to give you a fair shake. If it is just how it is that I'm going to, treat you as an individual, even if I despise you, right? Like this is just the obligation that's inherent upon me. And I think there's something really powerful in that. And at the same time, it's necessary for people who hold these values to be unafraid of voicing them culturally, because one of the tricks that happened in the last few years is that the progressive forces started saying, the paradox of intolerance.
Yeah, popular. Yeah,
it's a one-way ratchet, right? Like, we are allowed to call out problems, but you are not. We must be infinitely tolerant in the direction that we favor. But if you ever say, no, you're running contrary to our values, that's too much. And I think that's a fight that's worth having. Like, there needs to be this fight where we say, like, no. Our values are good and noble, and we're unafraid to say that. And we're unafraid to make that argument in front of people, because quite frankly, these values will cease to exist if people don't defend them. And on the flip side, the irony that the inheritors of the progressive philosophy championed by Woodrow Wilson, who was a big fan of eugenics in 1920s Germany, take the moral high ground. How dare you stand in the way of our progress towards these noble goals like our founder, Woodrow Wilson, would have had us pursue? Like, it's unbelievable, right? So part of this just has to be flipping the script and being willing to fight these fights. And yes, Rob, live your principles. And, be willing to say, it sucks that that this is not always an even playing field, but it never is. And nonetheless, America always wins.
Yeah, I think that's still where I'm at with that. So, ZXQ over on your channel gives $5, says, is the German National Socialist movement a communist race revolution? It's interesting. Communist, the operative word there, like it's socialist, right? Yeah, it's funny because there's a large argument as to whether it's a right-wing or a left-wing movement. On one hand, we just accept history teaches us it's a race right-wing movement. But then on the other hand, it certainly has to do with massive government regulation, incentivizations, and sort of socialist policies, which seems to be more akin to the left. Semantically, I think that it's worth having the argument. That I get tired of it. I've heard this argument a lot. What I will say is, when I hear words like fascist or things like that, what I always ask myself is, what about it are we really complaining about? Right? So when you hear some lefties say, he's fascist, what exactly about that, right? Like, you're not mad because fascism is a political movement and he's a member of a political movement. There are certain things that you associate with fascism you don't like, right? So, like, when I talk to a leftist and I say, what's define fascism, they'll say something like, well, Umberto Eco's 17, points of, and it's like, okay, but if you go through those, the left sounds very fascist to me. Like, it says things like, it's not enough to be neutral, you have to be an ally. Oh, you mean like it's not enough to be not racist, you have to be anti-racist? Or they look back nostalgically at pieces of history. Oh, like the civil rights movement. You see what I mean? So it's like, so for me, it's like the real problem with fascism is, right, sort of like violent authoritarianism. That's basically when people say, hey, he's fascist, right? And so if I could point out when your efforts to fight what you call fascism, you're engaged in the very tactics that you call fascistic, I don't give a shit that you're like, but I choose to define fascism as right wing. It's like, who gives a shit? You can define the term how you want. So to the question of, is it a communist race revolution? It certainly has the hallmarks of such, right? And I think that both when it comes to communism or sort of, that Austrian painter guy, right? That those are certainly movements to be avoided and the similarities in dangerous ways that we see.
Yeah, and I mean,
do you got a strong opinion on that, one way or the other?
Yeah, I think you could paint it that way, and I think that in some senses that's the linguistic. There's a linguistic game that sometimes gets played where they're like, like you were saying, like, what is fascism? What isn't fascism? What's the true communism? Or like like if we enact communism by democratic means, what's your complaint, right? And all of this is a distraction from the fundamental question, which is, do we have rights from our creator? Do we have equal moral dignity? And the answer is, for Germany, you did not. Only some people did, right? Only the Aryans did. That's what Nazi Germany was all about. Equal moral worth only for the Aryans. On the flip side, did you have it in communism? No, you did not. No, you did not. And ultimately, that once you let go of that truth, all hell follows, right? So, like, I mean, is it a communist race revolution? Maybe, but what it really is it's just an affront to self-evident truth, and I think that's the fundamental problem.
Phil, again, thanks so much. $5 says every good lawyer has an argument for why the sky isn't blue. Great lawyers have a convincing one. Yeah. It's true, right? Like, a lawyer can argue anything. It's sometimes more convincingly than others.
Yeah, that's why we have these limits put on us, because the truth is as you get better at the job, you could take a stab at anything. There has to be some limit, right? Otherwise, you go into the court, you're lying to the court, you're just making shit up, and it reaches a point where it's you're no longer in the service of justice. You're running contrary to it, because lawyers, you get good at the job.
And then Mr. Ubercross, have you met Mr. Ubercross? Have you talked to him? He's an attorney.
Yeah, Mr. Ubercross hangs out my chat. Really great guy.
Great guy.
Good family law guy. If you have a family law question, contact Mr. Ubercross.
Yeah, so he gives 10 on your chat and says, I don't have much of an issue with the Eastman memo. Is it really an unlitigated issue? I think novel areas of law can and ought to do call for more lenience for argumentation, which he never got. I agree.
That's a good argument, by the way. That's a very good argument.
So for me, there's a difference between, like, you come up with think of it this way, like Boasberg's initial, and we're going to move on to Boasberg here, but like his initial order, right? He issues an initial order, and for whatever reason, the appellate court's like, no, or the Supreme Court's like, no, you can't do that. If he's like, I'm going to do it again, then you're like, now, wait a minute. That seems to be above and beyond, right? It's like, we've already litigated this. We've litigated it. And you see some of that happening at these lower courts, not Boasberg specifically, but, that seems to be more egregious. For me, even with these, what I think are on their, like, for example, the example you gave earlier, right? Where it's like, it blatantly says there's no judicial review. And a judge is like, I'm going to review this judicially. And you're like, I would not be for being like, look, we're going to disbar you for that. I wouldn't mind the upper court being like, what are you talking about? This is clearly erroneous. But if she then the next week after being slapped down goes, I'm going to do it again. Now it's like, now wait a minute. That enters into the frivolous area where it's like, that's too much. We just told you this, but it had to be litigated first. And that's sort of how I feel here. Of course, I would say there are certain issues that would be above and beyond that, right? But I don't find that the Eastman memo was that egregious that it was like, even without it ever being litigated, we're just like, nope, fuck you, you're disbarred for even suggesting it,
Yeah, it's a tough one. Because, I mean, in theory, it was. He got a trial about his, or at least a hearing and a procedure about his disbarment. But like, in some senses, it's like, oh my God, like, thank God that wasn't litigated, right? Like, could you imagine? I mean, I think Trump would have lost, but that go into the Supreme Court, and then we're have like this, the court's going to decide whether or not Mike Pence, like, we're talking like. you would be on the absolute threshold of a constitutional crisis, like the country hanging by a thread sort of moment. Like, remember how mad, like Bush v. Gore, how crazy people got?
It's crazy.
It would be that, but like 1,000-fold. It would be much worse than that.
Well, it was how I knew. Like, it was amazing to me to see the trust the planners, right? Like, going into like January 20th, Biden being sworn in, that were like, oh, trust us, this case Texas is bringing, the Supreme Court's going to reverse the election. I was like, I'll put any amount of money that I'll mortgage my fucking house and bet you any amount of money. I don't bet, but if I did, like, there is no chance that the Supreme Court's going to be like, yep, we're reversing the election. This country would be on fire.
Oh yeah,
right. The evidence would have to be overwhelming. And that's why ultimately I can steelman the other position, right? The other position is this, where there's certainly so many anomalies. And hell, I'll go even further. I'll say there's probably a better than likely that at least one state was stolen from Trump in 2020, in my estimation, and probably enough to sway the election. Certainly, I think there was enough interference by official agencies, like former members of the intel community at the behest of John Brennan, etc., that were tipping the scale for Biden. I believe that. And you might say, so if you know that you just had the election stolen from you, right, wouldn't you, and you're like, we have to have some sort of legal mechanism to give a break for us to hear the case. I sympathize with that. However, my response to that is, tough shit. You had to win those cases before. I'm sorry. Because if we set the precedent that's like, well, if I have any legitimate questions, I could just delay in perpetuity. What the fuck do our elections look like going in the future? You don't think that every election there aren't going to be people saying, well, we have legal challenges, right? So we got to hold off on, and so the incumbent ends up staying, what, an extra 2 years while we sort out these legal issues? And so I totally am like, for me, it's like, no, you can't do it. You can't, and it's like, it's fucking sucks, and I sympathize with the Trump administration that I think there was a bunch of shady shit that go on, but that was up to you to do your best to try to bring those cases beforehand, and if not, then you aggressively pursue even after you're out of office to try to get justice. But the harm of being like, just because your gut told you this means that you could delay it while we sort out legal issues in perpetuity. I don't think so. I think that that's too damaging to the country. In my opinion, that's how I feel about it.
Well, and that was part of the logic that Scalia used in Bush v. Gore. One of his, not his only, but one of his points was, at a certain point, the election has to be over.
Right.
If we're litigating this for another 3 months, like, and we're counting it, like, no one's ever going to trust an election in this context. Like, no one will ever trust it. And, I would feel differently, and it's okay, but you guys may know Rob and I disagree about actually a lot of stuff. We've been on very good behavior for months and months.
Someday, yeah, but we're gonna yell,
But Rob and I, sometimes do just yell at each other. But if they hadn't had the chance to litigate all these elections, I would have felt differently about the Eastman situation. But they did, and truthfully, they Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, these guys, this was not a it didn't go very well.
The problem is that this was the problem, right? Scott Adams talks about this, right? Scott Adams basically said, I believe the election was stolen. And I also believe 99% of the things you hear of examples of how the election was stolen are false, right? In other words, when you push, you're throwing shit at a wall. I hope something sticks. The problem is everything that doesn't stick, it just becomes this malaise of like, well, nothing's here. And so now when it's like, wait a minute, we're looking at Fulton County and like there's credible evidence that hundreds of thousands of ballots were certified that shouldn't be, and chain of custody was lost for a bunch of ballots and stuff like that. That's serious, right? But the problem was when Sidney Powell's out there about to unleash the Kraken and it's bullshit, well, then the bullshit gets mixed in, right? I think that there was a travesty of justice. I think Bill Barr bullshit claiming trust us. We've looked at all this is bullshit. They didn't look at half of this shit. And yet, as with so many things with Trump, you got to point the finger at him and his group. They could have handled it more professionally. And here's the other thing. Like, I don't want to get off in the weeds. This is the last thing I'll say about this. Like, for example, here in Pennsylvania, forget about Trump. Pennsylvania Republicans were appalled with what happened in Pennsylvania. I could talk to you for hours about what happened in that election. For the first time, we had mass mail-in voting. It was a big shit show. There were all these legal cases. The Superior Court voted for the conservatives initially that mail-in ballots were against the state constitution. Then the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overruled it. But the travesty was how the Republicans got caught with their pants down. Like, they couldn't foresee what was about to happen. It's like, you dumb shits, you just massively changed the entire history of how the state of Pennsylvania is voted. And then you're sitting there with your hands in your pockets like, oh, shit, we should really get some legal cases together. Like, you think you weren't prepared? And so then there's no one to blame but you when you're like, we only had a couple months. It's like, you should have been there on the ground immediately pushing these. You know the nature of our electoral system. You know that the voting's occurring in November and we're certifying in January. It's not like that was sprung on you, right? That all of a sudden it was like, oh shit, it's like when your professor's like, by the way, that paper is due at the end of the week. You're like, oh fuck, I didn't know. You knew the paper was due in January. So the lack of preparation's on you. And so I only have so much sympathy where it's like, look, is it a short time frame? Yes. Are you professionals with nearly untold resources that could have been on top of this? Yes. And you weren't. And so that's the way it has to be. Suck it up. Say, hey, we're concerned about election security going forward. We'll still aggressively pursue anyone we think engaged in fraud, but time to move on. Well, I mean, I don't know what else to say,
This is a thing that I've criticized Trump for before, and I'll criticize him for it again. It's topical because, Bondi's out and about time. But if you watch lawyers in court, there's often the guy who talks. And the guy who's talking to the especially in a jury trial, has got a really beautiful suit, has got a really wonderful demeanor, very good with people, very charming on his feet, this sort of lawyer, right? And then there's another guy who's the law guy, who might kind of be a schlub, who's writing all the briefs, who's reading all the cases, who's getting all the details right, who's doing like the legwork to make the law perfect, but maybe he's handing the notes up to the other lawyer who's given the closing argument. Right? Sometimes Trump confuses the two. He thinks that the person who's given the pretty speech is the brains behind the operation, and they're not always, right? And you see this with his hiring sometimes, where he hires people because he's very focused on media. And he's like, they're going to be good on camera. They're going to say, unleash the Kraken. It's going to be this great meme, and people are going to be, it's going to be this wonderful media thing. But maybe not as much attention to like, how good are they on the law? Like, how good are they on the arguments? And I think that sometimes his hiring shows this problem. And
I'm going to say something controversial on lines with that. Maybe sometimes he likes to hire some attractive blonde ladies.
That seems to be a thing.
Yeah, they look good on camera, right? And on that note, Pam Bondi, feels like forever ago, but it has been since the last time we did a show. Pam Bondi's out. Now, let me play devil's advocate for a second. First, I'll say I immensely dislike Pam Bondi and thought she was the worst person in his cabinet for various reasons, which we can get into. But someone I like to follow, who's an attorney on X, Shipwrecked, Shipwrecked, if you ever read any of his posts. Very good. He's right-wing. He defended some January 6ers, but he usually has a more moderate point of view on things. He liked Pam Bondi. He thought, although Bondi messed up some things PR, that she had, her team had some big wins in front of the Supreme Court, and that when she sent the A team, they were on fire. That when she purposely put the sort of, not the PR people, but the actual attorneys working, and they got serious about a case, that she had a very good track record. I tend to believe that. I don't know how responsible she is for that, but what say you? Do you think that, like, look, even if she had some bad PR, that there were good things that happened under her tenure to help the administration?
I wouldn't give her credit for the Supreme Court wins. John Sowers, the Solicitor General, he's the guy who's making those arguments. Yep. That's his team.
Totally agree.
I don't really think she has much purview there, and I think that you can tell the difference in terms of the quality of the legal work that he did. Now, one question might be like, in the immigration context, there was some like, who found the Alien Enemies Act? That's like a deep cut. Like there was some deep cut lawyering there, but I tend to think that was probably the Heritage Foundation. That was probably, like the people like this who were doing that. So I'm not as charitable with Pam Bondi. And the thing that I think she really screwed up on and gave Trump some disservice, and I'm trying to build the most charitable case for her that I can. I think sometimes she got told, probably by him, I want you to make this point. I want you to come out forcefully. I want you to say free speech isn't hate speech, and hate speech isn't free speech. I want you to come out and say, we got the Epstein files, we're going to release them. And a better lawyer might have gotten fired earlier, because a better lawyer would have said, that's a bad idea and I'm not going to do it. Right. And then maybe you get fired. Maybe you don't get to keep your job because your boss wants someone who's just going to do it. But as a lawyer, you're supposed to be giving advice. You're not just supposed to be doing things, right? You're supposed to be saying, like, yeah, if we tell people we are going to release the Epstein files and then we don't, everybody's going to think there's a conspiracy. Like, this might be a problem. No, we got to have white binders. It's like, I think if we show people white binders and it turns out the Epstein files aren't in them, people are going to lose their minds. There's some advice that needed to be given. And maybe she was doing it behind the scenes, but she certainly didn't stick by her guns. And she then went out and said the line. And some of those lines were some of the most disastrous things in this presidency. Like, the handling of the Epstein files was one of the low watermarks for the presidency, by far.
It may be. I think that the Epstein, her commentary on the Epstein files, followed up by Trump, like the everything about it. Like, you just go through it like one disaster after the next. Like, every day you're like, well, thank goodness that's the worst we'll see, and then the next day you're like, my mistake. So when she does the binders with the influencers, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh my goodness, it's just the shit that was already released. That's a disaster. Then she comes out the next day and it's like, never mind, I just found out the FBI hid all this shit. It's on my desk. Then they're like, there is nothing. You're like, what? Then Trump comes out and it's like, this is all Democrat conspiracy. And if you're still concerned about Epstein, don't vote for me anymore. Don't support me anymore. You're like, oh my gosh. To me, it was a comedy of errors, one after another, that is amongst the worst self-inflicted political error I have ever seen. And
brutal.
I am of the belief that I don't know. Me and you, we're both going to admit this. We don't know the inner workings of what Bondi and Trump's conversations. I tend to think that not only do I think she wasn't pushing back on Trump, I think she was helping lead him to that. I think she's bad. And she's, she makes this mistake that other people made and that Trump makes himself a lot, which is like, they'll support whatever we do. Our supporters will support whatever we'll do. And, but it doesn't matter, because ultimately I'm of the belief that the buck stops with her for her actions and with Trump for allowing it to go on as long as it did, whether Trump was telling her to do this shit or not. And you hit it, like some of the shit, like that, for me, the lack of any action of aggressively going after the people in the Obama administration, et cetera, that were involved in the lawfare against Trump in various ways. But the big three is, my goodness, the Epstein stuff, which is just an absolute unmitigated disaster. The free speech quote, oh my goodness.
By the way, like, if you ever get annoyed, like I had a conversation that turned into a debate with PF Young earlier today about, it turned into a debate when he wanted to talk about Israel, of course. And
the Jews!
But if you ever want to make the best possible point for Israel has too much influence in our government, it was the Attorney General of the United States coming out and saying that there's a hate speech exception to free speech when it comes to specifically anti-Semitism.
Brutal.
It's totally contrary to every point on free speech the right had been arguing for the past 20 years. Like, it's just like, it's like, did you not read the talking points? Did you not read the memo about the position the right was taking about hate speech and free speech? Where were you? Like, you can't possibly say that. But also think about the James Comey stuff or Letitia, right? Like, again, what I mean about the proper role of a lawyer, particularly a really senior lawyer, like you're the Attorney General, one of two things had to have happened in that situation. You either have to say, Mr. President, it's not going to work. We can't do it, and it's going to make us look very foolish if we try, and maybe you get fired because you stuck to your guns. or you have to go out and you have to do a more credible job of sticking the landing, right? Like because if it's going to be that much of a shit show, a lawyer had to see that coming and tell the president this is going to be a shit show and it won't work, right? Like you have to, like, could you imagine, Rob, if you hired a lawyer and you were like, you hired me and you're like, man, I really want to sue somebody. Somebody's bothering me. I'm going to sue him, right? And I'm like, absolutely, Rob. Let's sue him. And then you lose real badly. It's embarrassing. You're just laughed out of court. And then you're like, Ryan, why'd you do that? And you're like, oh, I knew it was a bad idea, but I just did it because you wanted to. You'd be like, wait, I hired you for your legal advice. Why the fuck didn't you tell me this was a horrible idea and it's not going to work, right? Like it was her job to see that coming, that either to do it well and have it work, or to see it coming and give advice not to do this sort of thing. And I don't think she was giving that advice. I just can't believe she was giving any of that feedback.
And then, at one of the all-time worst clips ever on the Epstein files when she's testifying in front of Congress. This is an all-timer. I don't know if you saw this.
Because Donald Trump, the Dow right now is over. The Dow is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing. You're a great stock trader.
I am laughing too, and I am not a great stock trader. The Dow. Yeah, dude, you're the AG.
You're the Attorney General of the United States.
Who gives a shit? You're being asked about legal matters. Like, who gives a shit? You're now out there as a politician. Well, but the Dow, like, shut the fuck up. It's so unprofessional. And, her legacy, I think, is going to be one of incompetence, of some of these PR nightmares, and very little action, right? And I think that it's unfortunate for her personally because, what's your reputation going forward? She's young, I believe, right? So it's not as if, like, her career's over. She's, I assume she can go into private practice. She's
going to get a very cushy private job. She's going to make a ton of money. So,
but her credibility, for me, it would take a lot. And the other thing to say, and maybe you could speak on this a little, it's one thing to be a member of a presidential cabinet. And, like, for example, I'm somewhat sympathetic with J.D. Vance. I could be completely wrong. This is just my intuition. I don't think Vance is the biggest fan of this Iran shit, right? But he also knows his role as vice president isn't to lay out his vision, but to help and be the primary assistant for the president to outline his vision. And so, unless it's something so antithetical to what you believe, your role is to say, okay, I might disagree with this, but I am going to do my best to enact this vision and to sell it to the American people, right? An AG is different. Your job, it's not, there are things when it comes to that, to being a lawyer, that are beyond just being a wingman. There are ethical responsibilities you have that's like, listen, the law is not something that it's like, yeah, fuck it, it's malleable, we'll just do whatever we want. It's like, no, I have to fall within those confines. And as such, the advice and consent that you're giving to the president in that, like, role as AG sometimes means saying no. It's not like the vice president. Like, the vice president can also resign, or the, whatever, the Secretary of Interior, whatever. You get the point. But for me, it's a different thing, because the AG is unique in that it is the chief law enforcement, right? Like the person, and so that's how I feel about it.
And the president can fire the AG, right? Like, sure. I am openly saying that, like, as a lawyer, sometimes you have to tell your client this is a bad idea, and they might fire you and find a different lawyer who's willing to do it, right? Like that can happen, right? And in some senses, this is the Eastman conversation, which is like, if you keep firing lawyers and you keep looking for somebody who's going to do it, maybe you eventually find someone who's going to do it. And there's a danger there too. But I just, if you look at her overall legacy, it's hard to see her giving quality. It's hard to even imagine her giving quality legal advice to the president. And that's a shame, because there were things that needed doing, right? And a lot of them didn't get done. I will say, though, because she's out the door, she's no longer a problem going forward. She did issue something interesting on her way out the door. Did you see the FACE Act report?
Yes. So talk to us a little about, because I'm confused about some of it. So I know it's something you wanted to talk about.
Yeah. So she released this report. Remember, we talked about Don Lemon and the FACE Act, which was weirdly, it's a very silly law. It's a law that criminalizes obstructing both churches and abortion facilities. Same law. Very odd that those are held to be moral equivalent.
It's the left's religion, baby.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah, whereas we're gonna have your boy jump out and talk about that. But so the report was about the disparities in the way this law was used across time, and particularly in the Biden administration. And if you can pull up my screen real quick, interesting chart that they released. I think you'll like this. So this is FACE Act, and this is sentencing, right? So here are some pro-life defendants, and you can see the sentence that was requested: 78 months, 51, 50, 41, 33, 41, 41, right? 57, this is what they got, 27. And then pro-abortion defendants, 12, 16. What did they get? 12, 1, 1, 4. Requested 0, got 0. Requested 6, got 0. It seems like the sentences they were asking for when it came to pro-lifers were a lot heavier than the sentences that they were requesting when it was, about churches. But then, this is I thought the really interesting sentence, because they go through the cases. The special litigation section did not bring any civil FACE Act cases in response to protests or destruction at pregnancy centers or houses of worship during the Biden administration. So during the whole 4 years, if you were protesting outside of a church or a pro-life pregnancy center, there were no FACE Act charges. But they brought charges if you were protesting outside of an abortion clinic.
Yep.
And you can take this down, because I think that's the important sentence. But this is the thing that I think, I said this sometimes, where it's like, you can weaponize something without admitting you're doing it, right? I think that people criticize Trump for, his, like they call it, he's weaponizing the DOJ, or he's being overt in trying to use the DOJ to his ends. But you can weaponize it and just not admit that you did it. But that's what this report is about, is trying to put some numbers behind that to show, like, well, both of these are crimes, but one was being charged and the other wasn't being charged.
I thought, this goes in line. Remember when Chris Wray was asked about this? And they were like, what about these churches that are being attacked? What about these pregnancy centers that are being attacked? You remember what he said? Well, many of those attacks occur at night. So it's hard for us, and you're like, wait. If you're a fan of federal law enforcement, not a good time under the Biden administration. Between that and then, my all-time favorite during the Butler assassination attempt. Well, we couldn't be on the sloped roof. That's like, I could just see our enemies, like North Korea and China, perking up, like, really? All that military might in a simple sloped roof. That's all it requires, right? So, it is disturbing, though. And once more, it goes with sort of the guy in the FACE Act that obviously Don Lemon was the big name, but there was this other guy, and you see him all the time. And unfortunately, I forget his name. He's a bearded gentleman, and he's one of these professional protesters. And when this came out, I did sort of a deep dive, and this, you see this dude screaming at people in these protests all the time. And there was like this guy from this church in DC was like, dude, this guy's outside our church every week. And it's just like right in a major street in DC. And he's like, here's the footage. They have a camera out. And this guy's just, fuck you guys, you're going to hell. Your religion, screaming at these people. And it's like, that's a blatant FACE Act violation. It's just, no one gives a fuck. It's just, well, it happens.
But this is what I mean. This is kind of this is why I actually, on some level, appreciate President Trump making it more clear that the Attorney General works for him, because they do, right? And I do think the Attorney General should push back and give legal advice, and I've said that. But the other part of that is that every administration comes in and they put an Attorney General in place, and they have priorities, and they express those priorities, right? It would be insane. Could you imagine if Bernie Sanders had won, right? And then he's talking about the fat cats in Wall Street and all the corruption that they do and how they're stealing from the working man and all the stuff he's talking about. And then we have a 2008 type of financial collapse, all this fraud from Wall Street. And then, he goes to his attorney general, President Sanders, and he says, Attorney General, I really would like you to go prosecute these guys who were stealing from the American people, just like I talked about in my campaign. And the Attorney General goes, Mr. President, you can't talk to me about that. Separation between, of course, you can't tell me what your priorities are. Like, the idea that the president doesn't express priorities to the DOJ is insane. It always happens. It's always happened. It just happens behind closed doors. And sometimes it happens implicitly. Like President Biden, I don't know whether he was like walking around giving people memos, but he just simply hired people who were more likely to prosecute one kind of crime than another kind of crime. Your priorities are expressed. Like, because when you vote for someone to be the president, you want them to express their priorities. That's why they got the job.
What you don't want is, you don't want the priorities to be such it's like, hey, my allies, don't investigate them for crimes. That's clearly beyond the pale. Yeah. But there is an expectation that there are finite resources, and so you're going to have specific focuses. For example, we can see overwhelmingly the focus of the FBI under the Biden administration was January 6th and going after January 6ers. And for years, it had been like white supremacists and groups that weren't worth targeting or infiltrating were left-wing radical groups. For example, Antifa was just an idea, if you remember, right? It was, what are you talking about? It's amazing. Did you know that an idea actually got prosecuted in Dallas, around Dallas, for the first time for shooting an ICE officer in the neck? That was just an idea that they charged. Isn't that amazing?
But it's weird because the parents who were speaking up at school boards were domestic terrorists.
Correct.
That wasn't just an idea. That was like a demonstrable threat that needed to be investigated.
To me, it's again running afoul here, but when Merrick Garland wrote that memo, right, for the going after parents at school boards, the whole situation behind it was one of the most like, it amazes me, and I don't know if you've had this, I bet you have, right? You do a great job of actually like following oral arguments or reading these decisions. Most people, myself included, when it comes to that, is basically listening to people like you or listening to whatever. And oftentimes what happens is someone will go through it, give an opinion, and then everybody just repeats that opinion. And then, like, have you ever got the experience then when you'll look at it and you're like, wow, I see something that stands out that's completely different, that no one's really been focusing on. And you look around and you're like, I only have 100 people listening to me. These big voices, they're not talking about this issue, but I find it like that sometimes. And like when I saw Merrick Garland testify about that memo, and they were like, look, what was the evidence that you were using? And he cites two things is the reason for if you're not following this, there was this memo that he released basically that was like, we're going to have the FBI cooperate with local law enforcement to look at angry school board parents. And the parents were angry because the schools were locked down and their kids had to wear masks and shit like that. And so we're treating them basically as domestic terrorists. And when he's in front of Congress and it's being asked, like, why'd you do this? He cites two things. One, this letter that was written by America's largest teachers union, which they retracted, right? So they had to retract it because it blew up in their face because it was so bad. And then it's like, okay, so that's no good anymore. The piece of evidence, half the evidence you looked at was something that the people that wrote it retracted it. And what was the other evidence? And I shit you not, he said, some stories I heard on the news. And they were like, can you name one? And he was like, no. And you're just like, what the fuck? Like, imagine if President Trump came out and was like, or Pam Bondi, right? And came out and was like, yeah, we're going to have the FBI look into climate change activist groups. They're going to start going through them with the fine-tooth comb. And like the Democrats would be like, what the fuck? Why are you doing this? Well, because Halliburton wrote us a letter. And also we heard some stories on Fox News. We heard Greg Gutfeld say something. Like the Democrats would be like, what the fuck? You're using the FBI like that because you heard someone on Fox News? Because an oil company told you to do it? But that's exactly what happened. And we're all just supposed to say, that was business as usual.
But like, let's just play the probabilities game, right? Like Merrick Garland is a smart guy. He's a smart guy.
Yeah,
he's a savvy lawyer. Do you really think that Merrick Garland formed that opinion on the basis of like a withdrawn letter and some news stories he can't remember? Or is it possible? Is it within the realm of possibility that he was having a conversation with his boss, the president, or a chief of staff or somebody who was empowered to speak for Biden, because who knows what Biden's level of competency was at any period. But and a conversation was had where they're like, hey, we're very pro teachers union, we're very pro COVID lockdown, and these parents are kind of fucking it up. What can we do? And
that's exactly what happened.
They didn't tell him you have to prosecute them. They said, what can we do? And he looked into it because the White House expressed a priority.
That's exactly.
Of course, that's what happened.
You nail it. Because what people want, right? Like, to me, the quintessential case of this is Lois Lerner at the IRS, right? If you didn't follow this, if you're too young to remember, Lois Lerner at the IRS under Obama, she's the head of the IRS, and they were specifically targeting nonprofit organizations and auditing them that were conservative. So they were using keywords like conservative or patriot, words associated with conservatives and like 501c3s, and they were auditing them. And trying to like take away their tax exempt status, etc. And the conspiracy theory, I actually don't want to use that word because I don't mean this derogatively. People that are complaining about this, they seem to imply that this happened, that like Barack Obama was like, Miss Lerner, let's sit down and discuss this. I'd like you to go through a fine-tooth comb. That shit didn't happen. The way this works is priorities are set, right? And so specific conversations on the details don't need to occur. It's just like, hey, we have a problem with these big conservative organizations and they're making political headway, right? And so if you're at the State Department, you're like a little bug in your ear, and that influences decisions you make. We don't like those groups. And if you're at the IRS, little bug in your ear, and that influences decisions. And so that way, you don't need to sit down and discuss the details of this conspiracy. You just say, here's our concerns, here's our objectives, here's the direction we want to go in. And if you are the type of person that thinks, well, we're morally virtuous and the ends always justify the means, you don't need your boss to tell you, do this. You're just like, oh, okay, I know what I could do to help with that. And then in that sense, there really is no connection to Obama in that sense. I don't think, like, the idea of prosecuting Obama for a crime in that sense, like he sat down and specifically told Lois Lerner or told someone to tell, I don't believe that ever occurred. I legitimately don't believe that. And so I wouldn't recommend charges against Obama. What I'm saying, though, is the culture was such that here is the priorities and everybody knows. Like, they don't have to tell the press. Don't report on stories that are critical of Obama. The press just knows. That's the job. We're on Team Obama. Right? So that's what we do. No conversation necessary. And so I'm glad you bring that up because most people I talk to, it's like the opposite. They think that everything is written down. X, Y, Z, this is what you have to do. And I don't believe that's how it occurs.
But I mean, this is of course how it happens, right? Because you at minimum, you can set your policy by who you hire, right? Like, like you and I wanted to do a show. You wanted some legal analysis, you kind of looked into me and like, what are his takes? Okay, this might work out, right? I don't think you and Pisco doing this show would work too well because if you hired Pisco, you'd get a very different set of analysis, right? So like when you chose one lawyer over the other, you did it in part because you get along with him and in part because you're looking for analysis from a particular lens. When you hire somebody, you can make that like, I don't need to tell you all my priorities. I hired you because I believe you're going to follow my priorities. That was part of the criteria, right? And that can absolutely go too far. And I think we made the case that went too far with Bondi. So like, there should be a level of pushback and a level of independence where people just as a matter of, spine and backbone stand up. But the idea that this is mysterious in any way is laughable. Like, of course, if you've ever been in an organization that has groupthink, you've experienced this, right? Like, and people talked about this with the New York Times. Or when what's her name with the Free Press? Like, I'm blanking now on her name. The woman who started the Free Press. Like, whatever.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, when she left the New York Times, she talked about this. Whereas like, and Taibbi talks about this as well, where it's like nobody has to tell you that if you pitch a story about
Barry Weiss.
Barry Weiss. This climate change science doesn't seem to line up the way that I thought it would. It's not. It seems like there's some holes in this model. It's never going to get published. But if you wrote the opposite story, it would. And over time, everyone just learns the rules of the road, and it's all, like you said, unspoken, right? And that's how you group think. That's how you group think the room. So I mean, And I'm not even saying that this is like a prosecutable thing, Rob. I'm saying that like every administration does this. Like, of course they did. And the value of Pon-Bondi putting that report out before she left isn't that it's going to lead to charges or misconduct or this or that. It's just to make it obvious to everybody with numbers what's been true all along. Of course, the Biden administration influenced criminal justice. And of course, the priorities influence criminal justice. Like that, every president does this to some extent. It's just a question of, how candid they're being about it.
Yeah. A couple things before we go. Some rapid fire. Who do you think replaces Bondi?
Oh, I'm blanking on the guy's name right now, but Todd Blanche, the guy who's in place right now, I think he gets it.
Yeah, I agree. I think they'll stay with him, and I especially think because I think the news cycle has been positive to things Trump's going to want to hear, such as going after potentially James Comey, Brennan, other things. So I think as long as Blanche seems to be aggressive on that in the short term, he'll get the job. We did. God.
Holy shit! Breaking news! This is hilarious. I just looked at Andrew's Twitter. Pisco wanted to debate him, and Andrew finally said, "Okay, Pisco, since you will never stop complaining if I don't debate with you, I will debate you on this topic you requested. Does Destiny believe in moral facts tonight?" I have a feeling that debate will not happen.
Yeah,
so
I see.
Don't get
Pisco saying, "I'll debate you on if moral facts exist, but not destiny." It's funny. The funny trolling on that. I love that cat and mouse between those. We didn't talk about Boasberg, but real quick, just as quick as can be, Boasberg's like sort of holding the administration in contempt, got slapped down. What are your thoughts?
That's a big story, and we could have spent a lot of time on it. Yeah. So, but like the heart of it is that Boasberg. This was, for those of you who remember, he wanted the planes that were taking the TDA guys out of to El Salvador to be turned around, but his oral order said that the plane should turn around, but his written order didn't say that. And then there was a question about which one's binding. But while that was happening, the Supreme Court said he never had jurisdiction in the first place. So then he tried to hold the administration in contempt for failing to follow the order that he never had jurisdiction to give. So his illegal order, he was now saying the government should be held in contempt for not following his illegal order, and that he wants to hold an inquest to get more information about why this happened. And eventually the Supreme Court was just like, you can't do this. You can't do this. The circuit court said you can't do this. This has to come to an end. You're not a king. You can't just endlessly hold hearings in a case in which you never held jurisdiction and make the entire executive branch bow to your wishes.
Now, my understanding, I could be totally wrong about this, but from reading Shipwrecked and a couple other people, was whatever court it was that overruled Boasberg here, there is another court above that, and they're predicting that they will overrule this appellate court. And so this is likely to not be the last we hear of this in the news. Is that true, or did this go through sort of the highest possible?
No, it could go up more, but I don't think this is I don't think this ends in Boasberg's favor, because you got to remember, he never had jurisdiction in the case. He never had jurisdiction in the case. So the question is like, the argument Boasberg makes is, well, at the time I issued the order, you didn't know I didn't have jurisdiction. So you should have followed it. And if you don't follow an order, you're in contempt of court. So even though I didn't have jurisdiction, I get to follow this through. But the government told him, they said, like, who gave the order with the planes and ignored you, theoretically. And they said it was Secretary Noem. And they gave the information. And then he wanted to have like a whole trial. He was going to call up witnesses from the government. And then get this, Rob, he was going to have the plaintiff's witnesses, the counsel for the TDA guys. They were going to get to question government officials on the stand in order to develop information for him to determine who's at fault in this situation. And it's a wild overreach of federal power. So I don't think, I wouldn't worry too much about this going that much further. I think that this has to end at this point, because it's gone up, and it's gone up twice. And every time he gets what's called a writ of mandamus, which is, by the way, that's an extraordinary thing. That's not even an appellate court saying your decision was wrong. That's you going up to the appellate court and saying, the lower court judge is abusing their power in a way that is like unbecoming and must be stopped. They haven't even reached a ruling yet that I could appeal, but they're just abusing their power. Make them stop. And he's gotten mandamus twice now. like most judges don't get mandamus in their career in a context like this.
It's weird though. You don't hear the lefties when they're talking about all the court cases Trump lost. They don't, and the violation of like norms. You don't hear that. You don't hear them talking about these writs going out that are very unusual, saying that these courts are abusing their power.
No, it's all about, like Trump violated the court order, but then when it turns out the court didn't have authority and has been abusing its discretion, not a problem.
Real quick, we'll get through the remaining. Jefferson $2 says lefties long aspired to be Europe, which is now in shambles.
Yep.
Weld QC John, thanks so much for the 10. Over on Ryan's side says,
thanks, buddy.
Just home from the welding class. Happy to report 7 of the 20 students this semester passed their welder qualification test. 4 weeks left to go.
That is incredible. And by the way,
awesome.
I love these welding updates because there's something very honest about like talking politics and talking with like some fucking welders and being like, no, we're going to fix the country. I love John's welding updates.
Welders, truck drivers, carpenters. Yeah, I love it. Loodle Miss becomes a member, says, do the pride. Rob, show me your penis.
It's about respect.
I'm a syndicated radio host, So let me tell you. Let me give you a clue. It's a little thing called respect. Thank you. Jefferson, $5 says, the independent Justice Department felt like the left trying to get another institution they could take over that wouldn't rely on winning elections. Of course, the irony is they always accuse others of what they do. So they have their Justice Department basically be, in the words of Eric Holder, the wingman of the president doing his bidding. And then when Trump comes in, they immediately like, that's what your Justice Department will be. That would be outrageous. And the media parrots right along. Can you imagine? Perish the thought. Imagine if DOJ was going after a political opponent. Yeah, didn't we just have that for 4 years? Well, but that was justified. That was okay.
And also, didn't we see this in academia, right? Where it's like, it seems like you guys are kind of running some politically motivated activist programming here. You're not really doing academic work anymore. No, we're not doing that. And then when it became so obvious that they couldn't do anything but admit it, they said, well, yes, that's what we're doing, but it's a good thing.
It's a good thing, right.
Yeah.
Zach Yelpy, thanks so much, says, $10 says, that's still a huge fear with conservative nonprofits. Main first project are neurotic due to that possibility. Yeah, there's still, of course, of the nonprofit conservatives that got screwed over. Totally get it. And the grassroots over in Ryan's should have 5 memberships. Thank you, grassroots. So it was a crazy couple weeks, and I don't think it's going to end. There's some big cases coming up. I would imagine by the next time we do a show, there should be some more. I'm not incorrect in this, right? There's some cases on the docket we're expecting to be weighed in on.
There's going to be some big decisions. Who knows when we're going to get the birthright citizen decision, which is the one that everyone's waiting for. So I think we're all bated breath on that. But look, Rob, there's never any shortage of legal news. Yep. But you know what? If I was going to end tonight's show on something, it's not going to be legal news. I want to change the pace a little bit, Rob. Did you watch Andrew on trigonometry?
I saw a lot of it, yeah.
There is a clip in there that is my favorite thing that's happened on the internet in a long time. So let me just set the stage for you.
Okay.
Andrew made a joke about Destiny sucking 50 dicks.
Yeah.
Which did not land. He laughed. No one else laughed. But like, they're not going to laugh at that. But Andrew was very happy. So like, it was very funny. And then they had this whole back and forth about it. And there's a clip out of context where, they've been talking, they've gone down some tangents, but Constantine wants to return to the topic. And Constantine looks at Andrew and goes, I swear to God, verbatim, he goes, Andrew, I want to get back to the issue of Destiny sucking 50 dicks because I think it's very important. It is the perfect out of context clip. It's glorious.
I remember watching that part, but I don't remember that specific quote. But that is hilarious.
I fell out of my chair laughing. I was so fucking funny.
I'm going to talk about this some of my show tonight because what happened was Andrew brings up Destiny. The crux of what Andrew was saying about Destiny is it actually has a lot to do with what we were talking about tonight tangentially, which is like moral propositions. Is there a grounding for your moral framework or moral propositions? And if you don't have that grounding, then everything just becomes your subjective opinion. Mm-hmm. So a lot of political commentators aren't commenting on something that they could ground. They're just like, I feel that this is bad. And that's sort of the point that Andrew's making. Now, there's certainly arguments for and against that position. But then what happens is, Destiny is, of course, it's like someone's talking about me and invite me on the show. Invite me on the show. And then, of course, Andrew's like, why don't you debate me on this? And then Peace goes like, why don't you debate me on this? And Andrew's like, okay, I'll debate you on Destiny's moral. And Peace goes like, that's not what I want to debate. So that's sort of how it goes. But yeah, it's very interesting. I wanted to, we're wrapping up here. So there's one more thing I wanted to ask you. What do you feel about the Jews? What do you think about that? You know, a little bit of an inside joke we have here. Sometimes when Ryan's talking to people, they just like to end with, hey, we're about out of time. What do you think of the Jews? Like,
yeah, that conversation will be up on my channel soon. PF Young and I had a lovely conversation, and then a debate broke out, let's say.
Shit. But no, it's a good show. Anything planned here for the week?
So I've just had a marathon of content that I just did. I just did the debate, conversation/debate with PF Young just today. So I've been on board talking all day. I'm probably going to be offline for a little bit, but I'm setting up a debate on Friday, and I might have a spot coming up on a friend of the channel in the near future, but I don't want to talk about it yet. So probably give me a few days off, but I'll be back going strong at the end of the week.
Tomorrow I'm talking to Tony from Hello Listener at 8 o'clock. And then Thursday I have a debate on Christian nationalism. It's ironic. It's not a 1-to-1, but I'll be talking about a lot of the stuff you were talking about, Clarence Thomas saying, sort of the foundations and what our founding fathers intended. So that's going to be at 9 p.m. Eastern on my channel and hosted by Modern Day Debate. So that should be fun.
Oh, Modern Day Debate. That'll be a good debate.
Big debate coming up this weekend. Or wait. What's today, Monday? Next Monday. Owen Schroyer debating Andrew Wilson on University of South Carolina, I think. That's going to be very interesting.
That will be.
I think the Jews may come up in that debate. Who knows? It seems to be a hot topic. So, but no, it was a lot of fun. I'll put Ryan's link out there again. Please make sure you're going over there. Some of the best legal content and otherwise excellent content going out there. So, Ryan, it's always a pleasure, man. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Rob, the pleasure is all mine. Fun to rap with you as always. And gang, I've had a long day of talking, so I am not going to be doing a bonus stream tonight. So I'm going to call it a night and spare my voice. But thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you soon. Have a good one, Rob.
All right, take it easy, man.